Hey everybody, welcome back to another week's video as we continue after a little bit of a break for the holiday with our ongoing exploration of The Story by Randy Frazee. Sorry, I got the sun like hitting my face, kind of weird. The Story by Randy Frazee, the condensed biblical narrative presented in book form that we are working our way through as a congregation through the course of this year. It is great to be back as we continue on through this period that is really focusing in on the history of the nation of Israel. That's kind of where we have been. To recap, since it's been a few weeks, over the course of roughly 120 years, under three different kings, we had the United Kingdom of Israel, as is oftentimes called. That, of course, was King Saul was the first one before he was usurped after his death by David, and then David's son Solomon. They were the first three kings of the United Kingdom of Israel. And again, 120 years, so it didn't last real long. We actually saw in the last chapter with really the story of Solomon how that God has removed favor because of his inadequacies or his issues that happened particularly around the worship of false gods later in life, and how God had told Solomon, I will not remove the kingdom from you out of love for your father David, but I will remove it from your offspring. This particular chapter that we are in now, chapter 14, which is entitled A Kingdom Torn in Two, we see the story feature portions of the narrative and the records of various monarchs found in parts of the biblical books of First Kings and Second Chronicles. Now, what's interesting about these two sets of books within the biblical, within the Bible, both Kings, First and Second, and Chronicles, First and Second, really kind of overlap. We have a lot of the same details. In fact, some of them are identical. It is thought that in the original writing of these different historical books, these different historical writings, that some of them were probably just copied. So what we have in this particular chapter comes out of parts of First Kings and Second Chronicles, but there is that overlap between all four of these different books. Now, these various books really outline the various reigns of the monarchs of both kingdoms, Israel, or also known as Samaria in the north, or the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. So those are the two kingdoms that are established basically in what we have in this chapter. Some side notes, a little historical stuff. Samaria, this is the region where in the New Testament we hear that the Samaritans come from. That probably sounds kind of familiar. Initially, it was just another name for the northern kingdom. Admittedly, I don't know where Samaria, Israel, kind of where that overlap came from, but that was basically one of the names of the northern kingdom. Later, various cultures from within the Assyrian Empire will relocate there. This happens during the Assyrian control of the northern kingdom, and they would populate and intermingle with the residents who are left. And that's really where the Samaritan culture that we do hear about in the New Testament comes from. So that's just a little insight about the northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria. And then we've got the southern kingdom of Judah, Judah was the largest tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel. They continued to be loyal to David's line within the southern kingdom. They're based around Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, if you've ever heard the cultural name or the cultural description of Jew or Jewish, which I'm guessing you have, this is kind of where that comes from. It's of the tribe of Judah, so they are Jews, or they are Jewish. That's where that all originates. And so oftentimes when I'm talking about these different things, I talk about the Hebrew culture, the Jewish culture, or the Israelite culture, and they're kind of they're sort of all the same thing, and yet they're sort of still, there's some differences in there too, or some distinctions within where those names come from. I'm not going to go any farther into that. I'm even going a little farther than I meant to, but that's kind of the situation with that. So that's some of the background around this. This particular chapter, which again is pretty short, has three main sections. The first is we hear about the choice that King Rehoboam makes or has, and also the consequences of his choice. From there, we also move into the reign of Jeroboam in the northern kingdom of Israel. And then sort of the last section is we begin to see the back and forth identification and a little bit of information about the various kings on both sides. So circular thought, or a side note thought. Whenever I think about these two kings, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, I chuckle, and their names are way too similar, so I tend to call them Jerry and Ray to more easily identify them. I did a little bit of looking up about where those names came from. They're both Hebrew names, and as we've talked about before, Hebrew names tend to mean something specific, and both names do mean something specific, but what's interesting is the ending, the Boam. Boam comes from the Hebrew word for kingdom, and so it is possible, I don't know this to be true, but it is possible that these two individuals, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, that their names are actually originate just as almost descriptions of these kings of these two different nations. And that's why their names are so similar, rather than Jeroboam and Rehoboam being their given names. Maybe those are more titles, but that's just speculation. I don't have anything to back that up. That's, again, just some thoughts. Now, Rehoboam, Ray, as I like to call him, son of King Solomon. He became king at the age of 41. We hear he reigns for 17 years in the southern kingdom of Judah. We hear descriptions of him as being young. Now, granted, I don't think 41 is that young, but as being young, seemingly kind of arrogant, and he's also fighting a legacy of his father. Now, we talked about this a little bit in the last chapter, in the last video, again, a few weeks ago. But Solomon had issues in that he treated the people kind of harshly and used them a lot of conscripted labor, aka slave labor. There was a lot of things about Solomon that weren't really so great. So he had this reputation amongst the people. Even though Solomon was considered to be so wise and had a lot going for him, he still had a reputation of some issues with the people. And when Ray assumes the throne, the people want some assurances that, hey, are you going to treat us a little nicer than your dad did? And that's not what is going to go on. He actually speaks or spends some time with the older advisors to his father Solomon, does not listen to them, even though they speak to him with wisdom. And so we see that because of his choice that he makes, the kingdom divides, and the vast majority of people do not want to follow him. And that's where the divided kingdom comes from. During this same time, Jeroboam, aka Jerry, has been in exile in Egypt, as he had gained popularity under Solomon, really rose through the ranks, kind of a nobody who became very, very popular with a lot of the people, and eventually would replace Solomon's kid as king of a lot of the people. And perhaps this sounds really, really familiar. It should, because it sounds an awful lot like the dynamic between Saul and David, how David rises up through the ranks and becomes popular, and Saul doesn't like it, and eventually David takes the kingdom away from Saul's descendants. So we kind of are getting that repeating pattern going on again. Now, both of these individuals had issues as kings, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. They both reigned for quite a long time, not as long as the 40 years that we heard in prior kings, but they both reigned for quite a while. But they were both striving for power, ultimately. We hear that Jerry has to establish new places of cultural significance in the northern kingdom, particularly places of worship and places of government, in order to keep people from traveling back to Jerusalem and possibly being influenced by the kingdom of Judah and the presence of Rehoboam. So Jerry has to work really, really hard to establish these new places. And in doing so, he makes some pretty big missteps. This leads to different religious practices between the two kingdoms, as well as the establishment of idols. Now, here's another thing that sounds kind of familiar. He creates two golden calves, calls them, these are images of God, not intended to be idols, and yet idols nonetheless. And that sounds an awful lot like what we heard out of Aaron and Moses back in the day, when Aaron created an image of a golden calf and said, here is the God that brought you out of Israel. And God gets a little cranky about that. And so does Moses, but we've covered that before. We hear a similar situation here. Moving on from there, the last little section of this is the ongoing line of kings that were all oftentimes very problematic on both sides. There's a lot of conflict between the two kingdoms. Various monarchs' behavior was wildly different. Some of them are described as having been faithful to God and following God. Many do not. And throughout the course of all of the history that we find in First, Second Chronicles and First, Second Kings, that continues to be the case. Now, I've talked about this before. That might sound kind of familiar, but we have a lot of examples of some very erratic behavior and mannerisms between the various kings. Whew. With that, how about some problematic stuff? Because I'm always going to talk about stuff or acknowledge stuff that I find to be a little bit problematic. Rehoboam's choice. It reveals the danger of arrogance and thirst for power. Now, he seems to fall in the trap of thinking, if I may be a little crass, my apologies, but he seems to think his poop don't stink. And that you thought things were rough under Dad. Well, I'm awesome, and I'm going to be even worse than he was, or even stronger, or meaner, or harsher, whatever you want to say, than Dad was. And clearly, it does not go well for him. He also misses out on the wisdom of listening to experience. There's a bigger issue at play there, though, than just thinking that the older advisors of his father were right, even though they were, seemingly, and to say that the previous generations know everything and you should always listen to them. Now, this is not a shot at previous generations. I don't intend that in the least. I think what we can learn from this is the importance of all generations working together and listening to one another and acting accordingly, that we have there is wisdom to be gained from experience, and there is also wisdom to be gained within different experience or younger experience. So it really does go both ways. And what we read here is kind of one-sided. So admittedly, I find that a little bit problematic. Take away from this, listen to different generations, both directions, because I think it's important. The ongoing kings on both sides are an example of something we've talked about before, particularly as we look back through history, that you hold on to as much as you are strong enough to hold on to. But, we see this a lot in kingdoms, but it's definitely at play here. And we really see it in some of the different individuals that pop up, especially in the Northern Kingdom, because there was not really ongoing succession. There was Jeroboam and Jeroboam's kid, and then after that, all hell broke loose in terms of who took over for who. Some people thought they were really popular and they were really strong and they could last a really long time. We have one example of an individual who became king and lasted for a week before seemingly killing himself, or someone else killed him. That's a little bit ambiguous, but this idea that, hey, I am awesome and I can do this, only to find out, ooh, maybe I was aiming for something a little higher than I should have. I think that's always a good indicator for us, or good something to pay attention to. Last thing I want to talk about, last thing that's problematic, is the tension that lies between the two kingdoms, and there was a lot. It serves as a reminder of the danger that we fall into when we think I'm doing it right and you're doing it wrong. Now, yes, both kingdoms had things where actually it sort of seems like they had a legitimate gripe. And on the flip side, they had things that really were not legitimate, and whatever they were doing was not necessarily so great. So I think it's always important that we remain humble and we recognize that different ways of doing things, while different, are not necessarily wrong, and they are not necessarily worth fighting over, especially when we begin to damage the relationships between people who should remain connected. Remember, at the beginning of this, these were all cultural, the same culture. They were all the Hebrew culture. They were all members of the Israelite culture. They were all relatives, maybe going back a long ways, but they were all relatives. They were all descendants of Abraham. And yet, ultimately, this tension, this anger between we're right, you're wrong, no, we're right, you're wrong, led to these fractures and oftentimes warfare between kinsmen, which is really, really too bad. It also, final thought on that, it's also a warning against the idea of old wounds or old prejudices, that when we hold on to stuff that sometimes predates us so far that we don't even really know where the original tension came from, that's I think something that we should pay attention to. So that's everything I have. Welcome back. We'll kind of, after a break, I'll kind of get back into a little smoother rhythm of prepping these videos. This one did feel a little scattered, but hope you have a great discussion in this, and we look forward to the next chapter.